On this episode of the Darius Furu Show, I share how you can retain more from all the books that you read. So this is one of the most common questions that I get, and I used to have this as well, because as you start reading more nonfiction books, you think to yourself, what's the use? Because I'm not remembering everything that I read. Because we all get that realization sooner or later as we are starting to accumulate more knowledge, we forget most of the things that we read. And I think that is not a bad thing at all because that's how our brain works. Often we don't remember something until we actually need it. And that's when we start forming connections in our brain. But along the process, as we are reading things, we can think to ourselves, hey, what is happening with all the knowledge, right? At the end of the day, it's all about practice and putting things into practice. But I have 5 tips that you can use to retain more from everything that you read. So let's get into them. Tip number 1 is have a reason. And I say this because too often we pick up books that are bestsellers or that other people recommend to us. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good or bad thing. It just means that it might not be the right time for us to read that book. I have many examples of books that people recommended to me or that I bought years ago, and I, I picked them up, maybe read a little bit, and realized, well, this is not the right time for me, or this is not a useful book to me, because I wasn't dealing with that specific challenge that the book addressed at that time. So it didn't make sense for me to read that book. An example I have is Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and that's considered as one of the best books on productivity and focus. And I remember somebody who recommended to me in 2010 or 11. At the time, I picked it up and I thought it was really boring. But a few years later, as I read the book, I thought this was one of the best books that I read at the time. That was because at the time that somebody recommended the book to me, I wasn't dealing with a lot of stuff. I had a fairly simple life, but a few years later, as I had more stuff on my plate, that book was really helpful to me to get clarity. So always read books that are relevant to you because they will help you to form more connections in your brain. You will recognize more of the things that you read, and that will help you to retain more. So tip number 2 is one of the things that you often hear, and it's very effective. It is to see yourself as a teacher. If you read something and if you learn something with the purpose of sharing it with others, as in being a teacher, research shows that you will remember more of what you learn. And that is because we are more actively engaged with the things that we learn and read. And I continuously do this not only because it is my job as an online trainer and a writer and a blogger, but because I really like to share knowledge with people in my life. So as I'm reading books or watching videos, I'm at the same moment already thinking about how I'm going to share this with somebody else. So this is an exercise that you can apply right now by thinking about everything that you learned in this episode, how you can share that with somebody else. Just pick somebody who you regularly have conversations with, a coworker, a friend, family member, and think about how you can share the things that you learned. And that will help you to retain more of everything we learned talking about today. Tip number 3 is highlight and make mental connections. And this is something that is sensitive for a lot of people because I think that you should highlight paperback books or hardcover books, whatever. You can highlight them, you can write in them. That's my favorite way to use books. I think that you should use books and not just consume them or see them as some kind of sacred thing. It's an object, it's a tool, right? And the first time you make highlights in a book, it feels a little bit weird. but once you start doing it, you think to yourself, hey, why didn't I do this earlier? So make highlights of the things that you find useful or find important, and especially that you can use in your own life. And that's how we start making mental connections. But the most effective thing is when we also write about why we highlighted something. So what I often do is when I think something is very important, now you don't necessarily have to explain every single highlight that you make in a book, but every few pages or a few times in a book, you come across something that is very useful. Sometimes that can be one piece of information that you find very useful. Sometimes it's a little bit more. Doesn't really matter. But when you know, you know. So, oh, this is something that I have to remember. This is so good. What I do is I either write in the margins of why I think this is important, or if I read on my Kindle, I make a picture with my phone to Evernote, and I write below the picture why it's important, how I'm going to use it. And this takes a little bit more time and it makes the reading process a little bit slower, but it's really worth it because this is when we start actively reading. And when we start doing something actively, we remember it more because it's very different sitting down and reading a book compared to making highlights, notes, thinking about things, and making the concepts real in our mind. So that is one of my favorite ways to retain more. Tip number 4, visualize and imagine. So as you are reading the book, imagine yourself having a conversation with the author, or imagine yourself doing the things that you read about. Visualize the things that you read about. And as you start, again, actively reading, you will make more connections in your brain. And visualization is a very powerful technique. There's been a lot of research uh, published on the topic of visualization, and it's an effective tool that we can use to get more clarity, make more mental connections, and make the concepts that we learn real. Because at the end of the day, it's all about putting things into practice, right? And you can immediately start putting things in your practice, at least that's what your brain thinks, when you start visualizing it. And this is also, again, all the tips that we talk about today, you can immediately apply. So this is one of the things that I also do very often. I think about the things and I have conversations with the author in your head. And it's not a weird thing, it's just effective and it helps you to process information better. And then the final tip, very obvious, immediately apply one piece of information that you learn. And I really like this because we all know that information by itself is useless. Knowledge by itself has no application. You can't do anything with the knowledge that you store in your brain, right? It's no good unless you actually do something with it in the real world. Then it becomes useful. And one of the things that I really like is when people say that knowledge is not power, it's potential power. It only gives you the potential to do something great. And when we start applying, that's when we start putting the potential into real results. So what I try to do is I always challenge myself to put one thing that I learned from a book or from something that I read immediately into practice. And that can be just setting goals or having the intention to make a change, because you don't necessarily have to go out and do it immediately. But if you set out yourself to do it, have the intention, then you will get better at retaining the information and turning things into habit. So, what is something that you learned today that you want to apply? I challenge you to apply it right now, because if you don't do it now, you probably won't do it ever, right? So take the time, process the information, and then act on it. Thank you for checking out this episode. And if you have any questions about things that you want me to talk about, feel free to reply in the comments or send me an email. And until next episode, take care.